You wake up in a room the size of a closet, stone walls, a thin mat on a built-in stone shelf that passes for a bed, no window. This is a Roman lupanar, and this is your life. Let's actually put you inside this because the sanitized version of this history does a disservice to what these people actually endured every single day. The word lupa means wolf in Latin. The slang term for a prostitute in Rome was lupa, she-wolf. The place where they worked was the lupanar. Romans were not subtle about their taxonomy. You are categorized, named, and legally defined by what you did, and that definition followed you everywhere and touched everything. Before we even get to the day itself, understand the legal situation you're standing in. Roman prostitutes were registered. Actually registered with the aediles, the city magistrates responsible for public order. You had to give your name, your age, your place of origin, and your price. This information was recorded, you were given a license. And the moment that license existed, you became infamous, legally disgraced permanently. You lost the right to appear in court as a witness. You lost inheritance rights. You lost the basic legal protections that even poor free Romans carried with them as citizens. You were visible to the state, specifically so the state could tax you and simultaneously strip you of its protection. That's the deal. That was always the deal. Now, the morning. You're awake before most of the city because the work doesn't really stop. The lupanar had its busiest hours in the evening and night, but morning brought a different clientele. Laborers heading to work sites, merchants opening their stalls, men who wanted to be done before their households were fully awake. You don't eat yet. There's nothing to eat yet. Food is something you acquire when there's a gap, when the owner, and almost certainly there is an owner, a lino or lina, which is a male or female brothel keeper, decides you've earned a break. The relationship between a prostitute and a lino in ancient Rome was, in most documented cases, essentially one of total economic control. Many of the women in lupanars were slave outright. Others were technically free but bound by debt arrangements that functioned identically to slavery in practice. The lino fronted the registration costs, the room, whenever food and clothing existed, and then collected the overwhelming majority of what you earned to pay it back, indefinitely. If you're finding this series on ancient Rome interesting, and we've been going deep on this stuff lately, the gladiators, the Colosseum, what daily life actually looked like for ordinary people, hit subscribe and leave a comment on what you want us to cover next. It genuinely helps. Okay, back to the lupanar. The clients start properly around mid-morning. You have no say over who comes through that curtain. This is the part that's worth sitting with. You did not choose your clients. You did not choose how many. You did not choose what happened. The lino chose, or the client chose, and you were the room that the transaction occurred in as much as you were a person participating in it. We know from graffiti, and Roman graffiti is extraordinarily frank, some of the most direct primary sources we have, that prices varied enormously. The cheapest street-level transactions in Rome cost around 2 asses, which was roughly the price of a small loaf of bread. A registered lupanar worker might charge more, but a significant portion of that went to the owner. What you actually kept was, by most historians' estimates, a small fraction of the total. Now here's something the history books don't always linger on: the physical toll. Roman medicine had essentially no reliable contraception. There were methods, various herbal preparations, physical barriers made from materials I'll let you imagine, but their efficacy ranged from limited to non-existent. Pregnancy was a constant threat and a complicated one because a pregnant woman couldn't work, and a woman who couldn't work had no income and no protection, and in a slave situation, no recourse at all. Sexually transmitted infections existed in the ancient world, descriptions matching what we'd now identify as gonorrhea, syphilis-adjacent conditions, various other infections appear in Roman medical literature. Treatment ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. You worked through illness because not working had consequences that illness didn't. By afternoon, the character of the street outside has shifted. The Thermopolia, the food counters, are busy. You can hear the city through the curtain. If there's a gap in clients, you might get food, might get water, might get 20 minutes where nobody wants anything from you. Might. The evening is the busiest period. baths closed, taverns filled up, and the streets of Rome at night were a genuinely different environment from the daytime city. Roman streets had no public lighting to speak of. Wealthy people traveled with torch-bearing slaves. Everyone else navigated by moonlight and whatever spilled out of open doorways. The noise was different, louder in some ways, more unpredictable. Drunk clients are a different problem than sober ones, and the legal framework that already provided minimal protection during daylight provided even less after dark. We have graffiti from Pompeii written by the women themselves, or at least attributed to them, that gives you small windows into the emotional reality underneath the economic structure. These weren't women who were unaware of their situation. They were living in it, fully conscious of every dimension of it, and occasionally scratching something into a wall because it was the only form of expression available. The night ends not because you decide it ends, but because the traffic slows enough that the Lano has no reason to keep the operation running. You go back home to your thin mat, the curtain over the doorway. Roman men of every social class used these services openly without social consequence because Roman sexual culture placed essentially all of the stigma on the provider and none on the client. A senator could walk into a lupanar and walk out with his reputation intact. You could not walk out at all without carrying yours permanently. There were women who saved enough somehow to buy their freedom from Eleno. There were women who developed long-term arrangements with specific clients that provided some stability. But these are the exceptions that the sources preserved precisely because they were exceptions. The majority, the women whose names weren't recorded, got up every morning in a stone room the size of a closet and put one day in front of the other because there was no visible alternative. Rome was a civilization of remarkable engineering and philosophy and law. It was also a civilization that built a formal, licensed, taxed system for the exploitation of its most vulnerable people and called it order, and then charged them for the privilege of being part of it.